Hello and welcome to the Paddock Pass podcast brought to you by Renthal, Street Fly Racing and KTM. On today's podcast, we've got our post-Grand Prix discussion. So this show was made up solely of questions from our Patreon supporters. So patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast. Adam, it's been a bit of a crazy week for you. Obviously, all the weather in Barcelona and everything that's been going on, it's been fairly hectic.
Definitely, Steve. And we lost 4-1 to Middlesbrough last night, so that's pissed me off no end. It was my lovely wife's birthday yesterday, so that was a busy day. And as for the flooding in Barcelona, of course, nothing like the scale that we saw in Valencia. But it was, Dana just keeps throwing up these torrential thunderstorms. I don't think we're really going to be any danger for the final round of MotoGP. But it was a little bit hairy for a while, more kind of around the airport, which is just south of the city, like a 30-minute drive from the center. And I think there were some pretty graphic images and videos on social media. But apart from a good dousing in the city center itself, it wasn't too lively.
Yeah, hopefully it clears up over the course of the next week, because David, obviously for you, the bit of uncertainty about where we'd have the final Grand Prix, it looked like it was always going to go to Barcelona over the course of the last few days, but good to now have it confirmed.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as I understand it, it basically ended up coming down to Qatar or Barcelona, and Qatar wasn't willing to pay the amount of money that Dorna wanted, so it turned into Barcelona. Which is, I mean, it suits me because I was flying to Barcelona for Valencia anyway, so didn't have to change my flights. But and I think it's going to be interesting for the test because obviously it's the only thing I care about, lads. There's a test on Tuesday. The test is going to be interesting because of the lack of grip at the track, and that's really going to, I think, make progress. It'll be more useful than a Valencia test will have been as well.
Yeah, and Adam, that's one of those things that Dave's mentioned about the temperatures and everything. You're obviously a local for Barcelona. What's the weather actually going to be like that time of year? Because for all of us, we're used to going in the height of summer.
Yeah, at the moment it's freakishly warm. I think that's also a little bit contributing towards the somewhat erratic weather. But, it's 20 degrees during the day. It's almost t-shirt weather. And I think that's going to be good for the Grand Prix if this kind of like warm outlook persists, because as Dave mentioned, it's renowned for being a low grip track, the Circuit de Barcelona Catalunya, and if it was usual kind of temperatures around this time of year, then it would be problematic for tires and stuff. But I think the way things are at the moment, then it's just going to be similar to the kind of climate we get for Valencia anyway, which is very cool in the morning and the evenings, but around about sort of the afternoon time when the race windows kind of occurs, then we're going to be all right. But there were problems, I think, logistically with Qatar. The Losail International Circuit have Formula One coming up, I think the first weekend of December. There's a different configuration used for Formula One at that circuit, and obviously I have a different build for the paddock and everything else, so it would have been tight for MotoGP to get in there anyway. And as it works out, as the press release said from Dorna, that having the Grand Prix in Barcelona does tick a few boxes in terms of the solidarity aspect. It is a Grand Prix in itself. It's not like a substitution for Valencia, because Valencia has been cancelled. But there's going to be notable kind of dedicatory efforts, at this particular race in recognition of where we should have been.
Yeah, I think there's also going to be they haven't announced anything about tickets at the moment because it's going to be complicated with tickets. I know that the Valencia circuit was talking about basically allowing everyone to carry their tickets over to 2025, but I think there's going to be sort of some coordination about whether you can get in with your Valencia ticket to Barcelona and all the rest of it. But and I think it is. I think it's nice that it is actually close to Valencia. It's obviously the people of Valencia really have got other things on their mind at the moment, but it is sort of it is more of a solidarity thing. You do feel, I feel better that we're going to Barcelona than if we were going to Qatar.
We're actually recording this on Wednesday, but I'm going to going to Valencia tomorrow. Just to help. Take part in this Idols MotoGP movie, doing some filming down there. I'm quite surprised that they're actually still filming down there. I think either the production company are based in Valencia or they're set up in a in a film studio down there. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what I expect to find, but yeah, it will be slightly unusual going to Valencia and not really near a MotoGP race for this time of year.
Yeah, and obviously, Adam, enough for everyone watching us on YouTube, they're able to see how handsome you are. But what role are you playing in the
filter,
film?
Steve, it's the filter. I'm a journalist, somewhat of a stretch of the imagination. Got a couple of speaking lines, and I think I have to ask a quite contentious question in the press conference.
Did you kick?
Is there any data?
Yeah, exactly.
I actually remember for Valencia in 2015, after all of that, there was one of the press officers came up to a few of us at the end of, or at the start of the weekend, and said, like, any chance the first question you can ask can be about literally anything else, can be about the rider's favorite color, and then you can ask them about what actually happened on track. And it was funny just to see how different press officers had to deal with a situation like that. And we still see it now, obviously, with everything that goes on in racing. But it's always interesting when we go back to Valencia to think about what it was like for that weekend, because that was basically just like a movie, wasn't it, Ad? When you went down to that, and there was just something different everywhere. We had all the different press conferences. We had it where everything was televised. It was like a boxing match more than it was like going to a race weekend.
Well, there was an incident this week with Dave's favorite sportsman, Max Verstappen, where he kind of commented, where are the British media in the press conference? And I had a flashback to Cal Crutchlow basically asking the same thing. I think it was at the 2016 Argentine Grand Prix that he won the wet. Yeah. And then, everyone was busy running around the paddock because obviously Marc Marquez and Valentino Rossi had decided to, reinstigate their friendly fire. And it just reminded me of that a little bit. But those days, when you can pick and choose where you can get your fruity news highlights.
It's always a strange one, actually, because it's one of the things that we get asked quite a bit about, how you actually prioritize who you're going to speak to and how you divvy it up. And that's where we're always quite lucky. Obviously, for me, I'm working on Superbikes with Gordo and Evo, and there's Carlo and a few others as well that you work with a lot and you just basically trade stories with. But for the three of you, Neil included, it's always good to be able to have it where, Adam, you're going to go down and talk to X, Dave, you're going to talk to someone else, and Neil can go down and chat to someone else. And
Steve, we know that Dave's always going to talk to Taka Nakagami and Raul Fernandez, so we never have to worry about those debriefs.
And Luca Marini, I mean, he's my fave at the moment, just because he's always got something amazing to explain to you. So big Luca Marini fan here.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's move ourselves on to the Sepang weekend and just the end of our review from it as well, because on patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast, one of the things we do as well is we have our rider of the Grand Prix weekend, and it was a pretty easy one to decide this week. It was Jorge Martin that won with 53% of the vote compared to Pecco Bagnaia with 26%. And Dave, you would have been happy. Fabio Quartararo got 13% of the vote. I know that on the Sunday show you were waxing about Fabio's performance.
Yeah, no, I mean, Fabio Quartararo, Yamaha had a really good weekend. And it felt like there was sort of like reward for a lot of the hard work which has been going on. And it's the same with the Hondas. I mean, the Hondas haven't been too bad either. Like, there is real sign of progress for the Japanese factories.
Yeah, also, I think it's interesting because even the Hondas now are seeing what Yamaha are doing. A couple of riders, I think it might have even been Luca Marini, saying, we need to almost catch up to Yamaha in terms of the progress they're making. But Fabio Quartararo, Dave, for all of his positive lap times and performances in Sepang, was still quite raw about the potential and how far Yamaha are still off in terms of competitiveness. I mean, he's saying, look, our electronics are, slightly wishy-washy and we still need to refine them. And, the proof is on the paper there, and that has to be encouraging to everybody in the whole project. But I enjoy listening to Fabio's explanations of working with Max Bartolini and how basically that was the biggest part of the ship they had to turn around for 2024. And it seems like they're making some headway. But I think there's reason to expect a lot more from Yamaha. It's just a shame they only have data from two bikes.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those situations as well, lad, where to see where that development is going to go and see how quickly they're able to make that progress interesting. And that actually was one of the questions that we had from one of our patrons about Honda's progress as well. So we'll come to that in a couple of minutes' time. Just to look at some of the comments that we had from patrons about why they chose the rider they chose. I think Neil Champion put it pretty well when he said Jorge Martin is doing exactly what he needs to do to win this championship, and that's why he got his vote. Mike Cross was talking about the mental strength for Jorge Martin, which again, that came to the fore when, especially in the sprint, Pecco crashes out. And it's in that second half of the race where it's so easy to make a mistake when you're not under pressure. This was really impressive from Martin.
Yeah, 100%, Stephen. And the thing as well is that, certainly by his own words, in the last two Grand Prix, Jorge Martin's been really skirting the edges. He's been testing the limits. He's been near to crashing several times in Thailand. Everything that he seemed to say in Sepang as well was a real test of, his sort of synergy with the Desmos Adichie in the GP24. But when you see the footage of him, it doesn't matter from what angle, he's just completely able to bend that motorcycle to his will, which wasn't really the case in 2023 as we remember. So I think he earned that points lead and is looking in a fantastic position to wrap this thing up. Yes, Barcelona is going to be an even bigger test of the pressure he has to cope with, but I think he's had a little bit of a ramp up to this situation in the last 2 weeks, so that's going to be of a benefit.
Yeah, and Dave, we had a comment from Adam Pearce saying that despite screwing the pooch in the sprint, Pecco didn't give up on the Sunday, and that's why he got Adam's vote for the, not our Adam, but Adam Pearce's vote for Rider of the Day. But it's a good point about Pecco to be able to bounce back like that.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is exactly it. I mean, he is just... if you were to ask me who is the fastest rider in the world at the moment, I wouldn't be able to tell you because it's so close between Bagnaia and Martin. But Bagnaia himself said basically, what was it? Shit Saturdays, love Sundays. He is so much better. He can't cope with there is something about the bike where he just doesn't manage on Saturdays. He crashes too often on Saturdays, and I'd love to find out what. That's my project for next year. I think because if he can prove that, then he's going to be truly formidable. Even though he's getting quite a strong teammate next year.
What's your theory, Dave?
If you look at the way that he takes his time to get up to speed, he always has a difficult Friday and they're sort of like faffing around and they're trying to find something. And then suddenly Saturday he's there. And then Sunday he's just invincible. So I think, I don't know if it's just sort of like the mental side of it, wrapping his head around it. He's an incredibly intellectual rider. He's just very rational, whereas you feel that Martin is much more of an instinctual rider. He rides on his gut. He rides on feeling, whereas Bagnaia rides on feeling and analysis. And I think that maybe he's thinking too much. He's tripping himself up because of that. But they. And maybe he just doesn't like the feeling of the way of the bike trim in the sprint race, where you've got the half a tank, where you've got the softer tires and you're pushing harder because you are pushing that much harder. We know that Pecco Bagnaia can do one phenomenal lap. What he doesn't seem to be able to do is 10, 12, 13 phenomenal laps after another.
I think it has to be a mental thing because, like you say, apart from the tires and the tank configuration for the sprint, there's not really that much difference. And you see the way he's attacking, in the first laps of the Grand Prix, which is only what he had maybe 3-4 laps in warm up to go through the same section where he crashed on Saturday just to get those ghosts out of the way. I mean, it was phenomenal, just the intensity. So where's the big difference? For me, it has to be a mental thing, maybe just the conditioning that he has 10, 12 laps at most to really bust this thing. And, maybe that kind of extra pressure to get more urgent is something that doesn't sit well with him.
I also wonder about the electronics, whether they've got just a slightly different electronic setting for the sprint race, and this could also be a factor. But there is clearly, I think you're right, Ad. I think a big part of it is mental, but again, it's sort of like trying to piece all of these pieces of the puzzle together to sort out why he's struggling.
Can I just ask either of you a question? So jump in whichever you want to answer. But do you think is there also a point where people just refuse to believe that riders evolve? Because all I keep hearing, like obviously for me, I'm in the Superbike paddock, so I'm outside of MotoGP. I'm watching it every weekend, obviously, but I see Jorge Martin as being incredibly impressive this year. He's not making big mistakes. He's riding right on the limit. And everyone seems to think he's going to fall off, he's going to crash, he's going to make a mistake, he's going to throw something away. Now, obviously, he hasn't really done that this year. But it's almost as if people are looking back and conditioned to think about what he's done in the last few years, rather than thinking that he can learn from his mistakes. And for me, he's learned massively from all of his mistakes.
Yeah.
And he had quite a lot of mistakes to learn from, but he's put them to good use.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I mean, we know that he's had some psychological coaching, which has helped, some mental coaching. We know also, I mean, to me, riders learn every single time they go out on track. And they get a little bit better. But the trouble is, like, everybody gets a little bit better. So, they're all learning. But yeah, I mean, quite clearly, Jorge Martin is not making the same mistakes. And that's very much the point.
Yeah, also, I think, I mean, there was the crash at Sachsenring where you think, okay, he still has the tendency to do that. But I mean, he's 26 years old, Steve, and I think the fact that he can still progress, and it's clear to see in 2024 is what's going to make him a worthy champion, because he has just been that consistent force. And Bagnaia is pretty much paying for just a couple of moments of misjudgments, and ultimately the championship's going to be separated by less than 10 points.
Yeah.
So it's those narrow margins.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just about the fact that it's going to be quite funny whenever he takes the number one plate to Aprilia.
Yeah.
So I think that's what everyone's quite keen to see, really.
Yep, 100%.
But let's move on to
Steve,
another number one. Go on, Ad. Sorry.
I want to say, first of all, how is, just to prove that everybody can evolve and improve every year, we just have to mention David Emmett's forecasting abilities, not to mention his tampering.
I was just about to move on to another number one, and it's a very, very unfortunate number one, because Dave, you're going to win the Paddock Pass podcast, well, the host league.
Yes.
And you're going to win that pretty comfortably. Now, I'm still blaming Neil, because I couldn't get Ducati in as a manufacturer at any stage this year after what he did to me at round one. And it's been a complete disaster. And that really is the secret, because I've had Pecco and Jorge Martin as my gold riders for most of the season, and then Bastianini for the last third of the season with Martin, and I was having to throw in like Yamaha and God knows what as my team. Probably like I think I was putting in Gas as my team and all this kind of stuff, just to try and find some budget to be able to sort out the rest of my team, and it was just a disaster. I think I'm 11-4-5, Ad, so I'm slightly up the road from you. But it's one of those things that we've had 1,700 players in the league this year. It's actually been really good to see the growth of it. And we've got a good prize going, Ad. And it looks like Danny Team 32 is in a great position to be able to win that. So we'll see
how many points ahead is he, Steve?
He's 75 points up.
Okay, well, that's not much. I mean, there's still enough for Dave to be able to hack the code and sort that one out. But,
no, I don't think I'm going to get that close. And 75 points is, I mean, like, because I'm looking at, can I go up or down a little bit? But I mean, you go up and down. You tend to gain maybe 10, 20 points a race sort of thing, or lose 10 or 20 points. But yeah, I mean, my secret has just been to have, as Steve said, Ducati as a team. I had Grassini for a while, or I had Ducati as the manufacturer, and I had Grassini for a while, and then I had Pramac as a team, and that's basically the foundation, and then the rest you're just swapping your riders out.
Yeah, just looking at the league as well, for all of our major contenders, there's actually not a lot to choose between them in terms of who they have on their teams. They've both got the same gold riders, slightly different with silver riders. They've got Ducati obviously as manufacturers, and then it's Ducati factory or Pramac as your team. But what's interesting is that there could be a little bit of movement at the top, because Satan's Hell are third and they've still got a turbo to use. So we'll see how that plays out. But Dave, you're almost inside the top 50, so it's really impressive. Neil's actually done quite well to get into the top 200 as well. And Adam, we've got a good goodie bag coming for the winner at the end of this.
Yeah, that's right, Steve. Thanks to our friends at Alpinestars, especially the ever affable Chris Hillard, will have a goodie bag coming to the winner. And, I think also between us, one of us is going to have a SuperTech S10 or M10. I think it's an S10. M10 might be the motocross version, but their new helmet, which passed a very rigorous safety test in turn 2 at the beginning of the Grand Prix last weekend. So the helmet obviously does the job.
Yeah, and that was a really scary crash, and good to be able to see that all the safety equipment makes a big difference for that. And we've obviously had good examples of that as well in Superbikes this year with Toprak and his crash earlier in the year. And it just goes to show the importance of having your airbag, having your back protector, having good helmets and everything else. It's always one of the things that everyone always skimps on. Everyone wants to spend all the money on the bike, but not on the safety equipment. Yeah. And I've seen it where mates of mine are going out in gardening gloves and then wondering why they've broken their hands. So it's definitely worth spending the little bit extra on that. And it's worth spending the little bit extra on becoming a Patreon supporter as well for us. So patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast. If you do that on these post Grand Prix shows, we answer your questions. And we've got quite a few questions in for today's show. So I mentioned earlier on about Zarco's performance on the Honda. So we're going to kick things off with Joe Mueller. And Joseph's asking whether or not Zarco is outperforming the other Honda riders right now, or are Honda putting a little bit more development into his bike to try things for next year. So, Dave, what's your thoughts on Zarco's performances?
I mean, it's mostly Zarco. Zarco is basically on the same kit as the Repsols. Joan Mir is still trying too hard to win, which is why he keeps on crashing. I think he's the rider with the most crashes this year. Luca Marini is building very carefully and just being, he's literally just testing this year, trying to be more competitive. And I think Zarco is the perfect bit in the middle where he is pushing the limit, seeing what it's capable of, and then sort of finding out what is possible. But genuinely, because the interesting thing about Zarco is listening to him all year, battling most of all with his mentality, with his attitude, trying not to win or think about winning, trying to think about how to optimize his performance, get the most out of each weekend. So, he's genuinely been really, really impressive. He's just done a fantastic job this year. So, hats off to him. I think a lot of it is Zarco himself.
And obviously enough, one of the big things for, not so much for right now, is we've got the Barcelona for the final round. That test afterwards, Dave, I know you've already mentioned how much you're looking forward to the test, but that is the moment when we get to see an awful lot more about what Honda can bring for next year as well. The way that the concessions have worked this year has been quite good because they have bought a lot of new parts actually during the year. I think Yamaha have had 3, maybe 4 different engine specs throughout this year. One of which went pop in Sepang after a lap and a half for Fabio Quartararo. So
and only had one.
Yeah, exactly. And so, it's been very good. It's been very good for them to actually help catch up. So there's been a lot of stuff that's been on sort of on view or sort of in view. But again, I think I mentioned this before. Testing is good at Barcelona. It's going to be really good for Honda and Yamaha because what they're really missing is grip, and Barcelona doesn't have any grip. And so if you can find grip at Barcelona, it means that it's the bike doing the work and not the track.
The most fascinating thing at Barcelona, Steve, I think is going to be the Pramac team, because Yamaha have this extra load of resources and a lot of staff, and by all accounts a bigger budget, everything, but it hits a real bottleneck with just having 2 bikes out there, like I was saying earlier. Yep. Now they're going to have 4 bikes for the test, and even though the climate or the fact that Miguel Oliveira might not be fully fit, there's no confirmation actually if he's going to be racing the final round in Barcelona. I don't even know if he's available to test. But then you got Jack Miller jumping on a Japanese bike for the first time in 6-7 years. There's a whole acclimatization period to go through for this particular one day, so they're not going to be able to seize a whole load of usable data, I would have thought. But the fact that they suddenly have this widening of the channel for data is an important thing for the Japanese. And, if they can reach, they're going to reach the same status as Honda in terms of, their potential net. And that might allow Yamaha to have the bigger, or steal the bigger march, coming towards Sepang next year. For Honda, as Dave was saying, it's, they've certainly thrown the kitchen sink at it, but it seems a bit of a scatter gun in terms of the approach. I mean, Luca Marini trying different stuff. I mean, Taka Nakagami's been reduced pretty much to a bit part player in terms of having the last updates. So it's hard to really discern any kind of strategy there. But, Yamaha have been incredibly busy. I think Fabio Quartararo has earned every euro, of his contract this year, moving into that bigger one, of course. But I think the Japanese are on the way. They just need a bigger palette to paint with.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us into a question we had from Hayden Forever, who was asking about the Japanese bikes and the fact that Zarco looked fantastic at times in Sepang. Quartararo, obviously with the top 6, was very impressive. For Hayden Forever, it looked like the progress is real, but was there any specific reason that we saw it at Sepang is what their question was. So, Dave, was it Sepang specific, or can we expect something similar?
I think it's a little bit of everything. It is. I mean, Yamaha have had a really good flyaway. Starting from Motegi, the Yamahas have done really well. They've got, I think they've had a new frame, maybe a new swing arm. They've had a new engine, but the engine hasn't really made that a difference. Fabio Quartararo has been saying, look, we tried something very different with the electronics, and that made a big problem. And really, Yamaha's biggest problem seems to be the electronics. So yes, that is definitely it's sort of the combination of lots of things. The same with Honda. Honda had a whole bunch of new stuff to test at the Misano test, which they started using Misano 2 Motegi. Everybody got it by, I think even Nakagami had it by Motegi. And then lost it again because there isn't all that much. There isn't all that many parts of it, but it's just having all of that stuff, and then going through a few races, gathering the data, and then being able to put it together.
Yeah, and I think it's obviously going to be interesting to see what happens with Augusto Fernandez on the Yamaha as well. And Augusto talking about when he expects to get his first chance on the bike. It mightn't necessarily be that post-race test as well. We had a question in from Frumble, and Adam, I'm going to come to you for this one. Will Aprilia pay Jorge Martin a bonus if he wins the title and brings the number 1 plate to Aprilia for next season?
Yeah, nice big tongue-in-cheek for that question, I think, Frumble. Of course not, because, Aprilia aren't even going to start paying Jorge Martin until, 2025? I mean, I think, the fact that he's an independent team rider, and we're sure we're going to have that bashed around our heads, when Martin achieves the championship in Barcelona, as you would assume, means that he can jump to another manufacturer. I do wonder if he'll be allowed to talk about the Aprilia at the Barcelona test. That's something that if he was part of a factory team, like Bagnaia's teammate, then for sure he wouldn't be allowed. But being independent, there's a possibility that he could already start to tell us about what he thinks of the RSGP. But yeah, I mean, it's like you said earlier, Steve, it's going to be funny seeing, that number 1 on the front of a different bike next season. And I think we were talking in our WhatsApp group across, post Sepang. And I'm not sure if it was you, Dave, that asked, will Pecco Bagnaia ever win another championship? Because, of course, Marc Marquez is going to be his teammate next year. Perhaps we could say the same about Jorge Martin. I mean, he might arrive to Aprilia and find that the motorcycle needs a full year of sorting out to fit it to his style. We saw how the GP23 didn't really suit his particular technique in 2023. And, it could be a similar scenario. I think it's going to be a real test of his ability to set up a bike and to make it work. Of course, it's a big career chapter for him, and he's going to be handsomely paid, whether he brings the number 1 plate or not. But yeah, it will be quite amusing to see that status in another manufacturer.
Yeah, I think it's always one of those ones where there's always that question mark about when a rider changes manufacturers like this, but particularly now whenever you've got such a dominance for Ducati, and to move away from that bike, Martin thoroughly deserves to get paid and thoroughly deserves to lead a factory, and that's ultimately what made him make that decision. But it's going to be tough for him on that Aprilia, and I think if you were to have made that decision a year ago, everyone would have thought, oh, Aprilia's on the up, they're making their progress, they're even contending with a Leish for a championship. Whereas now you're looking at it a little bit differently. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over the course of the winter and into the opening round next season. We've got a couple of FIM related questions as well. So Dave, I'm going to come to you with one from Paul Carter. And Paul is asking, what's actually checked in pit lane during a session when the riders are taken away by the FIM officials?
Well, there's a few things that they check. They are constantly checking tyres, tyre pressures, and which tyres are in use. There's a bunch of scrutineers who are walking up and down paddock doing that. The FIM has a scrutineering box. Basically, one of the garages turns into a technical inspection box, and there it is mostly, or during the session, or rather at the end of the session, it's just bike weight, or for Moto 2 and Moto 3, it's combined rider and bike weight. The bikes themselves are scrutineered at the start of the weekend, and they get a sticker on, and then that's it, sort of thing. And also, if someone completely destroys a frame, breaks the thing in half, they'll rebuild the bike, and they'll have to get another scrutineering sticker. But yeah, basically during the session, what they're checking is tires, tire pressures, and weight.
And we had a question in from Mike as well about the FIM and just how effective the FIM are as an organisation. And the question also centering around George Villegas. And Mike is saying that George is a very high-profile guy and very comfortable in the limelight. And then the question is just about what the actual role of the FIM president is. And Adam, I think that there's no doubt that George Villegas is very comfortable in the limelight. I don't think there's ever been a camera that he hasn't spotted.
Yeah, that's right, Steve. He's pretty much put himself as the front man for the organisation. I did quite a long interview with him actually as part of sort of the MotoGP book, and he was explaining how was it this year or last year he was working for like 40 weekends, traveling to different disciplines and championships and sports. The ability to always jump in front of a camera, it can great, but I think he's sort of taken it upon himself to be this visual symbol of the FIM. I mean, there are kind of parallels a little bit to what we're seeing in other political arenas going on at the moment. But you cannot fault Villegas for his proactivity. I think the Intercontinental Games scheme that's going to run at Jerez might be a little bit of a stretch too far. I don't quite understand. I understand the concept of this and trying to get riders from around the world to compete in a kind of motocross of nations format, but it still seems a little bit difficult to achieve, considering the way that the international racing calendar is wedged together. But I mean, Villegas has transformed the FIM. He's brought in extra revenue. I think they just recently opened their new office building. They're going to have a new interactive museum in Switzerland. The FIM, before, I think with the previous, the predecessors, Vito Ippolito and also Francesco Zerbi, were pretty much old men, would start press conferences by excusing their bad English and then not talking in English. They were very much kind of the typical old boys club, whereas Villegas has tried hard to increase the FIM's role and importance, really. Whether they deserve that or not is another question, but when you see the amount of staff and specialists they are shipping to events and trying to ensure standards, then there is sort of methods behind the madness.
Yeah, I kind of think that one of the big things that the FIM needs to probably do going forward is to be less of a volunteer system and more of, you're an expert, let's bring you in and do this as your full-time job, because that's when you're able to make that big step. Now, obviously, it also means that that's also where lots of other sporting organizations, if you want to look at FIFA, the IOC, whatever you want to look at, that's whenever things get a little bit murkier. But it's one of those balancing acts for it. Just about the Intercontinental Games, I really wanted to be involved in it for this year because it's something new. I think it could be something that in the next few years could be quite cool. But I only think that will be the case if they bring everything together, which I'm sure is the long-term goal, where you go somewhere like Aragon, let's say, and you've got an enduro track on the outside of it. You've got supermoto at the go-kart track. You've got, every discipline that you can put in, motocross, everything. And you bring all of those together and you do that, because just speaking of, we were talking about Valencia, obviously, at the start of the show. Valencia, just before everything that hit it, held the FIA, the car racing games. and they had it where you had go-karts, you had sports cars, you had Formula single-seaters, you had esports, you had all these things all brought together for 3 days. And it was 8 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock at night. And it was actually pretty cool, because it was a full celebration of the sport. And I think that's what the Intercontinental Games could be long-term. But it's one of those situations where, are you better off to start it small, or are you better off to start it the way it should be done, where everything's brought in together? And that's going to be interesting to see what happens whenever it starts.
Yeah, just quickly, it's easy, I think, to sort of sling a bit of mud at Jorge Villegas because he does seem to pop up, whether it's presenting trophies or at the front of some sort of ceremony or a press conference where he perhaps isn't really needed or his presence isn't relevant. But then behind the scenes, I think there's a lot going on, Steve. I mean, the FIM's remit is to promote motorcycling and motorcycle racing, whether that's to represent groups we don't see so much, such as women's racing. That's been launched this year. By all accounts, has been, pretty successful in terms of generating a profile. Environmental issues, also representation, with government groups in terms of sort of promoting the benefits of motorcycling. There's a lot of stuff I think they do behind the scenes that we don't always see as MotoGP fans. So you can't be too judgmental, I think.
Yeah, I think that definitely with the WCR as well, what we saw this year with it was it did generate a lot of interest. And I'm quite curious to see what happens for it in the next few years, because everyone wants to talk about how great the battle was and this, that, and the other. Supersport 300 was actually a more competitive field, because in the WCR, it was 3 riders, maybe 4 riders at any given round that were able to be competitive, whereas in 300s, you had it where it was the top 10, top 15. And I think that's where you need to have that bit more depth. But Supersport 300 was, it was a per class whenever it started, and then it got deeper. So that's what we need to see from the WCR as well.
Yeah, but I mean, in terms of narrative, basically 3 or 4 people fighting is always much more entertaining or much more engaging than 15 riders battling or 10 riders battling. That's always been my problem with Moto3, and why I think it's been a much better class this year, where it's basically been like every race there's been 4, 5, maybe 6 riders who've been battling out. The championship has been very, very clear throughout. It's been the same riders over and over again, and I think in WCR as well. I mean, I'm going to go after the season. I'm going to go and watch some of the WCR races, because it has been that real rivalry between those 3 women who've really taken it to each other.
Yeah, I think that it's also worth noting that Dave loves it because Colin Vire is very competitive. So your inner Dutchman comes to the fore. And Dave, I'm actually going to come to you with what I know we don't have like our star question of the week, but this is actually my star question of the week, because TV Room Raccoon, who's one of our most vocal users as well on the Discord channel, has asked us a really interesting question about Marc Marquez and the fact that Marc has gained 13 points after remounting from crashes through the season. 4 at the Jerez Sprint, 5 in Thailand, and 4 in Sepang again. Why does he salvage more points from mistakes than other riders? Is it something about his mentality? Is it a technique? What's the secret for him?
I mean, about 80% mentality. He just does not, like, all of these riders have got never give up tattooed somewhere, but a lot of them do, and Marc just never does. If you think about how he's been riding the past 4 years in pain and with a severe injury, and really had to force his mind and his body to do that. I think this is just an extension of that. This is just an extension of the fact that he is willing to try to do anything to try to get back. Secondly, I mean, apart from the fact that he's on a Ducati, and it is much easier to get to pass on a Ducati than anything else. Luke and Brie was saying, they're basically on another planet. Also, I just checked at Sepang, and actually Franco Morbidelli crashed, and then he also made up a bunch of places. I think he finished 1 place below Marc, but he crashed out behind Marc as well. So it's a bit of a bike, but also we also know that Marc is one of the best riders actually overtaking people. He's just very, very good. He's prepared. He understands the limit that little bit better, and can get to it. But 90% of it is just like being able to accept the fact that you've crashed, forget about it, get on with the challenge ahead, which is, okay, right, I've crashed, forget the win, forget all the rest of it. Let's see if I can score some points. Setting yourself, immediately making that mental switch to set yourself a new challenge.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that Mark's always been unbelievably good at, is just having that mental switch. You even have to just go back to the 125 race in Estoril, because that was where we got the best example of it, and there's countless examples of Mark being able to come through the field like that. And we're going to move on to a question from Jared. And Adam, Jared has asked us about Pecco Bagnaia and whether or not Pecco can continue his brilliance into the future, because there's no doubt about it, Bagnaia has been brilliant this year. To win 10 races is an incredible feat, as Jared says. But how much of that comes down to the advantages that the GP24 has over the field, and how much of it comes down to Pecco's talent? And Adam, I'm asking you because you've obviously sat down to interview Pecco for your upcoming book, so you've got some good insight into the man.
Yeah, it's definitely talent, Steve, but also the fact that he's embedded in a team and an environment that benefits his character, the way he goes racing, and his demeanor when things are going well and going badly. And I think if anything, we all laud the talents, rightfully so, of Marc Marquez, but he's going to have to go into that environment and not only usurp the rest of the MotoGP grid, as he tends to do, but also the guy who's going to be a few meters away from him. If anything, Bagnaia is going to lose this championship just because of Saturdays. And Dave, as he's mentioned, has got his project for next year to try and discover, why Pecco has been particularly vulnerable this year, and whether he can make that improvement for 2025. Because if he does extend the kind of Sunday form into Saturdays, then he's going to be unbeatable. I think realistically, we have to discount Martin from being the same sort of force next year that he has been this year, because he needs to get his head around the Aprilia. And if he hits the ground running with the same sort of sport form and speed that he's doing right now on that black bike, it'll be amazing, completely against the odds. So Bagnaia, I think, is going to have a little bit of a freer run. Yamahas are still going to be in transition. It'd be interesting to see how KTM improved the RC16, whether that can sort of surge to being a competitive bike, because with Brad Binder and Pedro Acosta next to each other, then they're going to be a competitive package. But I think the light's really going to fall on Bagnaia again for 2025. And then, Marquez is going to have another little adaptation process, but not that big. And then we could just see one of those bizarre sort of Formula One-ish seasons where it's like McLaren or the Red Bulls or Mercedes like fighting against each other in terms of the factory Lenovo GP25s. But I think all credit to Bagnaia. I mean, to win 10 races in a row and not be sort of celebrating a championship already, again, highlights the job that Jorge Martin has done.
Exactly. I mean, you saw very well saying, yes, the GP24 is definitely a role of it, because that ruled a whole bunch of people out. But if you look at how good Jorge Martin has been, and Air Bastianini has had a good year as well, on and off. He showed that he could win on it. Pecco beat them. Pecco was more competitive than them, but just made more mistakes.
Steve, just before we move on, just a reminder to everybody listen to the podcast, that we're backed by KTM, ktm.com. Go and have a look for some new motorcycle material if you're in the market for a new bike. The EICMA show is happening right now in Italy, and KTM have already announced some new models. I really like the look of the 1390 Super Duke GT in particular. If you're a GS rider like Dave and you fancy a bit of a sport tour or something a little bit more edgy. So edgy, in fact, I think they did their publicity campaign with like a crossbow, just to show how kind of gnarly the sports tourer GT can be. Then that motorcycle is definitely going to turn your head. Fly Racing as well. Fly have got some big announcements coming up in terms of their endorsements for 2025, which will be their 26th year of existence. They have a fantastic helmet, the Formula S, that's really safe, has a lot of technology inside it. I use the stock one and it's really comfy, good for ventilation as well. And of course, rental.com, who have been backing us for a couple of years. If you've got a road bike and you need an accessory, then head to rental.com, because there's loads to choose from.
Yeah, I always think the Fit My Bike tool is really useful on that as well. You're able to just put in the year, the manufacturer and the model, and gives you all the parts that you're able to add to that. So check that out on rental.com. And just about the 1390 ad, whenever you shared the pictures of that with me, I thought that just looked like a bike that wanted to eat the rider and just destroy them. So I thought it was a really cool looking bike. And we'll move on to our next question. And Sean has asked us on Twitter. And Sean's making very clear it's on Twitter, not on X. So you get extra points for that, Sean. The first few laps at Sepang were amazing, but it soon turned into a bit of a boring race at the front. When will this change for us? And was this just down to tyre pressures? I know that you talked about this on the show on Sunday night, but Dave, the tyre pressure situation, is there any end in sight for Sean?
No, I mean, first of all, Sepang is generally produces pretty tedious races anyway. There haven't been very many truly great races there, except perhaps once the weather has played a role. But I mean, it's mostly down to weather. Down to tyre pressures, the amount of aero and the loads. Because the thing is, the problem with tyre pressures is that there's a huge amount of air on the bike, which is taking air away from it, but it's also producing load on the tyre. The ride height devices are also producing load on the tyre. Basically, Michelin keep on having to step up their front compounds to make it harder every time, just to be able to cope with the loads which are being put on it. It might get a little bit better in 26 when we finally get Michelin's new front tyre, but really we're going to have to wait until 2027 when they get rid of the ride height devices, when they reduce the aerodynamics. They can't get rid of it. They can't get rid of it because if they try to, then there's a few people in the FIM versus sort of 20 or 30 in Ducati and 20 and 30 in Aprilia. KTM have got sort of the Red Bull F1 people working with them. They just can't keep up. So they're always going to be outgunned in terms of regulation. So they have to try to make them as simple as possible. But yeah, I mean, what I do hope is that after 27, they do are much quicker to step in whenever people start putting aero on new parts of the bike, like on the tail, like on the front mud guard, the side wings on the wheels, all those sort of things. We need to start getting rid of those as well.
I actually didn't find the race that boring, Steve. I mean, obviously the first laps are amazing, but then I think you had the second half of the Grand Prix had that context of the championship, and you're kind of thinking, well, who's going to make a mistake? There was a period as well when Martin was getting slightly closer to Bagnaia, and you're wondering if the soft front really was going to be the right call or not. I think there was like a veil of tension there that really just kind of made the race quite gripping. To have the race is not going to be that crazy for that long. And then you have a different kind of phase to it. And I thought it was quite, fascinating, actually.
Yeah, I think it's one of those ones that, for me at least, whenever you get used to seeing Johnny against Toprak for the last couple of years, we had racing like that the whole way through a 20-lap race. Obviously, a superbike race is different. It's a little bit shorter. Tires are different. Bikes are different. But when we had that start in Sepang, you just saw what makes you love motorbike racing, but you also knew it wasn't going to last that long because that's just not how MotoGP is anymore. And I think I kind of side more on your side, Ad, than on Sean's side in terms of what we saw at the end of that race. But it was also one of those ones where it starts to stretch out. And then once Marc goes down as well, you lose another rider, and then suddenly there's a big gap back to third. And I thought when Martin started to close back up on Pecco with a few laps to go before he made his mistake, that you thought like, oh, maybe we're going to get this right at the end as well. But that little mistake cost us that chance of the real fight for the last couple of laps. And I think that if it hadn't been for that, I think it would have been a really gripping end to the race, a great start, and then just that middle ground of almost a waiting game for someone to make a mistake. And I think it was one of those races that it wasn't going to grip you the whole way through, but it was better than quite a few of the races we've seen this season for different reasons. So for me, it was one of those races that it's probably I would have given it a 7 out of 10 if I had been on Sunday night's show just to give it a grade. But we'll move on to our last question, and it's a question for Mark Jackson about the Moto3 class. And Moto3 is becoming more and more KTM dominated. What's the latest chat on the tech changes and the grid for 2025? And Dave, I know you've been doing some digging on this, but it's been tough to find too many acorns on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there is a big technical change coming soon, probably 2027. That's going to be the most interesting thing. If I remember correctly, everything is frozen for 2025 and 2026. But yeah, basically, it's down to Honda to step up. So yeah, I can't answer this at the moment. It's something I'm going to try and dig into at Barcelona to find out what's going on. See if anyone is willing to talk to me. I have requested interviews a couple of times, and I need to go back and send in my requests again.
Yeah, so we'll see what you're able to find out over the course of the final race of the year in 10 days time down in Barcelona. Dave, we're going to bring an end to the show, and you've got a few days off to be able to get yourself ready for that final race of the year. And Adam's obviously in a hurry to get himself down for his movie star debut. Adam, you have to get yourself into makeup, you have to get yourself looking great, and be ready for it. I'd recommend just a little bit more of a bronzed look. I want you like a bronzed Adonis, holding that microphone, flexing away, and just looking like a champion on that movie.
If I can take away some of the grey hair, Steve, you never know. But yes, all this effort
I
just
can't
to
do
be
that either, Andy.
all this effort just to be reduced to the cutting room floor. But I said I'd do it, so I'll be there. But it'd be nice to have a free weekend. I'm actually looking forward to watching my two boys do their respective sports.
Yeah, and obviously enough for us here on the Paddock Pass podcast. As we said earlier, a big thank you to Renthal Street Fly Racing and to KTM for supporting the podcast. But most importantly, a big thank you to everyone on Patreon for supporting us as well. These Wednesday shows have actually become really interesting as the season's gone on, just because we've been able to get more and more input from all of our patrons. So sign up as a Paddock Insider and you get the Paddock Notes show, or 20 to 30 minute wrap-up show at the end of each day of the Grand Prix weekend. You also get plenty of interviews and features through the course of the season, and whether it's for MotoGP or Superbikes, I think we've had in and around 100 extra contents through the course of this season, so it has been really busy on Patreon for all of our Patreon supporters. So for $10 a month, you're able to get that, and you get a 10% discount if you sign up for the annual pass as well. We've also had it where for our Paddock Insiders, they've been able to join all of our competitions if you've been an annual subscriber. So that's where we've been able to send two groups of vans to two Grand Prix. So two Paddock passes to two Grand Prix. I think it was Sepang, it was Saxon Ring, and it was Saxon Ring and Motegi for the Paddock passes. Then we had our competition for tickets to Silverstone, and we were able to send 5 pairs of people to Silverstone as well. So just being able to enter those competitions is really cool. We've also got some winter competitions coming up as well. Arai are going to give us a helmet, so that's going to be one of our winter competitions, and we've got plenty more as well. So definitely worth signing up on Patreon to get your questions answered and get yourself into those competition entries.